The dust settled in lazy golden sheets, coating everything Jedediah Stone owned in a fine powder of failure. It covered the cracked leather of his boots, the warped wood of his porch, and the silent, empty corral that had once held a herd of 50. Now it held only memories and the ghost of a lowing sound that echoed in his ears. He gripped the porch rail, his knuckles white and bony, and watched the lone figure leading the lone cow down the trail that snaked away from his ranch. $50. That was the price of his final surrender. The cow, a dappled calico he called Bess, was the last living thing on the broken stone ranch besides himself, and now she was gone, sold to a stranger for a handful of silver dollars that felt as heavy and useless as lead weights in his pocket. The buyer was a man out of place, dressed in a city suit of dark wool that must have been hell in the Texas heat. He was clean-shaven, his hands soft, and he'd paid the $50 without a lick of haggling. Jed had watched him, suspicious at first. Men like that didn't wander into the scorched heart of the territory looking for a single aging cow unless they were lost or running. But the man, who introduced himself as Alastair Finch, seemed calm, his eyes taking in not just the cow, but the whole sorry spread, the parched earth, the dry creek bed, the house that listed like a tired old man leaning on a cane. Jed had stood his ground, his face a mask of hard-won pride. "She's a good cow," Hit said, his voice raspy from disuse. "Gives good milk when the grazing's decent. Not much of that round here lately." Finch had nodded, his gaze lingering on the dry creek. "Everything's feeling the pinch, it seems. I'll see she gets a good pasture." And that was that. The transaction was as quick and brutal as a mercy killing. Now, the silence that followed was profound, deeper than the quiet of a lonely night. It was the silence of utter finality. Jed sank onto the top step of his porch, the wood groaning under his weight. He pulled a small, tarnished silver locket from his shirt. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of his wife, Martha. Her smile was the last bit of green in his desert world. "Well, Marty," he whispered to the image, his thumb stroking the worn metal. "I held on as long as I could. Nothing left to sell." He'd fought it for 5 years, ever since the fever took Martha. The drought had started before that, a slow, merciless thief. It stole the grass, then the water, then the cattle. His neighbors sold out one by one, most of them to Silas Croft, a man who collected land the way a vulture collects bones. Croft owned the valley now, all the way to the river. He'd even bought up the rights to the creek that bordered Jed's property, rerouting the last trickle of water to his own vast herds, and leaving Jed's land to bake into hardpan. Croft had made offers, of course. Insulting, predatory offers that Jed had met with a stony glare and a hand resting near the butt of his Colt. This land wasn't just dirt and rock to him. It was the place he'd built with Martha, the ground that held all his good memories. Selling it to a man like Croft would be the final betrayal. But pride didn't fill a belly or buy seed for a new start. The $50 in his pocket was all he had to his name. Enough for a horse, maybe, and a week's worth of provisions to get him to some other town where he could look for work as a hired hand. The thought soured in his gut. He was a rancher, not a drifter. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the cruel, dry hills in hues of orange and purple. Jed didn't move. He just sat there, the locket in his hand, as the world went dark, feeling the weight of his 47 years press down on him like a physical blow. He fell into a fitful, dreamless sleep right there on the porch, the empty corral standing guard over his ruin. He woke to the sound of a horse, not on the main trail, but coming up his private track. His hand flew to the Colt at his hip, his body tensing. It was early, the sun barely a suggestion in the east. Only trouble rode this early. He squinted into the gloom and saw the familiar silhouette of the city man, Finch, riding the same steady bay horse as yesterday. But he wasn't leading Bess. Jed got to his feet, his joints protesting. "Forget something, mister," he called out, his voice thick with sleep and suspicion. Finch dismounted, his movements precise. He didn't look like a man who'd come to complain about his purchase. His face was serious, intent. "Mr. Stone," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness, "I came back to correct a mistake. I believe I underpaid you." Jed's eyes narrowed. A deal's a deal. $50 was the price. He wouldn't take charity. Not from this man, not from anyone. "It was the price for the cow, yes," Finch agreed, stepping closer. "But it wasn't the cow I was truly buying. It was a test." Jed's hand hovered over his gun. "A test? I ain't in the mood for games." "No games, I assure you," Finch said, his gaze unflinching. "I needed to know what kind of man you were. Yesterday, I saw a man at the end of his rope selling his last possession. You could have lied. You could have told me she was a young prize winner, tried to squeeze more money out of a stranger who didn't know better. You didn't. You told me the truth, plain and simple. You're an honest man, Jedediah Stone, and an honest man is precisely what I'm looking for." Jed was silent, his mind struggling to catch up. None of this made a lick of sense. Finch took a deep breath, his city demeanor cracking just a little to reveal a flicker of excitement. "My name is Alistair Finch. I'm a geologist. I work for a consortium of investors back east. For the past 6 months, I've been surveying this territory, following geological strata, taking samples. The big ranchers, like your neighbor Mr. Croft, they see grass and water. I see what's underneath." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Mr. Stone, this drought, this parched earth, it has revealed things. Veins of rock, shale formations. And on your property, in that dried-up creek bed, there are signs, more than signs. There are seepages." "Seepages," Jed repeated, the word foreign. "I know that creek. There's nothing there but cracked mud and lizards." "To the naked eye, perhaps," Finch said, a genuine smile finally breaking through. "But it's there. A thick, black, viscous substance pushing its way up from deep in the earth. The same substance that's starting to make men in Pennsylvania and Ohio outrageously wealthy. They call it rock oil, petroleum." Jed stared at him blankly. The words meant nothing. "Some kind of snake oil, you mean?" "No, Mr. Stone," Finch said, his voice dropping, full of a strange reverence. "It's the fuel of the future. It burns brighter than whale oil and cleaner than coal. It will run factories, power machines, light up entire cities. And based on my surveys, your land isn't just sitting on a puddle of it. It's sitting on a sea, a deep, vast reservoir that could be worth, well, unfathomable is the word that comes to mind." Jed felt a dizzying sensation, as if the ground itself was shifting beneath his feet. "This had to be a dream or a cruel joke. And you're telling me this? Why? You could have bought the whole ranch for a song yesterday. Why come back?" "Because men like Silas Croft are predators," Finch said, his tone hardening. "They'd cheat you, buy this land for pennies on the dollar, and leave you with nothing. My employers are businessmen, not thieves. They understand that a man who has a stake in the venture, a man who knows the land and has a reason to protect it, is the most valuable partner you can have." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a thick envelope of papers. "This is a contract. It's not an offer to buy your land, it's an offer of a partnership. We provide the capital, the equipment, the expertise to drill. You provide the land. In return, you will receive a 25% share of all profits from every barrel of oil drawn from this ground." He held the papers out. "I'm not here to make you a rich man, Mr. Stone. I'm here to make you a millionaire, many times over." Jed's hand, the one that had held the locket of his dead wife, trembled as he reached for the documents. He felt the world tilt on its axis. Millionaire! The word was so absurd, so fantastical, he couldn't even form a picture of it in his mind. He looked from the papers to Finch's earnest face, then out at the barren, dusty land that he had been ready to abandon just hours before. Hope, an emotion he thought had been buried with Martha, began to stir deep within his chest, fragile and yet fiercely alive. Before he could utter a single word, the thud of multiple hooves broke the morning quiet. 3 riders crested the ridge, moving fast. The man in the lead was broad and imposing, his face weathered into a permanent scowl. Jed didn't need to see him up close. He knew that swagger, that aura of arrogant ownership. It was Silas Croft, with 2 of his hard-faced hired guns in tow. They reined in hard, kicking up a cloud of dust that momentarily obscured them. Croft's cold eyes swept over the scene. Jed standing on his porch, the well-dressed stranger beside him, the official-looking papers changing hands. A dark, knowing smirk spread across his lips. He'd clearly been watching, waiting. "Mornin', Jedediah," Croft drawled, his voice dripping with false congeniality. He ignored Finch completely, his gaze locked on Jed. "Didn't figure you for having company so early, especially fancy company." He finally turned his predatory eyes on Finch. "Whatever business you think you have on Stone's land, stranger, you can forget it. This pitiful patch of dirt is as good as mine." Silas Croft dismounted with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who owned the ground he stood on, even when he didn't. His spurs chimed a sinister little tune on the hard-packed earth. His 2 men remained on their horses, their hands resting casually near their holsters, their gazes flat and watchful. They were wolves waiting for the signal. "This is private property, Croft," Jed said, his voice low and steady. The fragile hope Finch had ignited was now shielded by a wall of old, familiar defiance. He tucked the contract papers into his shirt, a protective gesture. "You ain't welcome here." Croft chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Everything the sun touches in this valley is my business, Jed. You know that. I've been patient with you, sent my boys with fair offers, but my patience has about run its course." He finally acknowledged Finch, looking him up and down with open contempt. "You some kind of lawyer from back east? Come to help old Jed here read the fine print on his foreclosure notice?" Alastair Finch, to his credit, didn't flinch. He adjusted his coat, a small, neat gesture of composure. "My name is Alastair Finch, and my business is with Mr. Stone, the legal and rightful owner of this property." "Is that a fact?" Croft took a step closer, crowding Finch, using his size to intimidate. "There's the law on paper, and then there's the law of the land. Out here, they ain't always the same thing. This land is worthless. The creek's dry, the grass is gone. I'm the only one with the resources to make anything of it. I'm doing him a favor." "Your favor is an attempt to acquire mineral-rich land through coercion and misinformation," Finch stated, his voice as sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "A fact that will be noted in my report to the U.S. Land Office and my employers." The mention of the Land Office gave Croft a moment's pause, but it was fleeting. He sneered. "Mineral-rich? Are you telling me you found a shiny rock? Jedediah, has this fancy-pants talker filled your head with stories of gold?" He laughed again. There ain't no gold in these hills. My men have crawled over every inch of this valley. We weren't looking for gold, Jed said, finding his voice. The partnership offer had put steel in his spine. For the first time in years, he wasn't just defending a memory, he was defending a future. Now, I'll say it one last time. Get off my land. Croft's smile vanished. His eyes turned to chips of ice. Brave words for a man who sold his last cow for pocket change yesterday. He turned back to Finch. Here's my final offer. I'll give him $200, cash, right now. That's more than this heap of dust is worth. You take your geology books and you ride out, or things are liable to get complicated. The offer is not accepted, Finch said calmly. It ain't his decision to make, Croft spat, his gaze locking back onto Jed. It's yours, Jedediah. $200 or nothing. And by nothing, I mean I'll fence this place in and make sure not so much as a jackrabbit can get in or out. You'll starve in that shack. Jed looked at the hate in Croft's eyes, then at the quiet determination in Finch. He thought of Martha, of the promise he'd made to never let this land fall into the hands of a man like that. He thought of the impossible word, millionaire. The answer's no, Silas. Now get out. The air crackled with tension. For a long moment, it seemed violence was inevitable. But Croft, for all his bluster, was a calculating man. He preferred strangulation over a quick shot. He backed away slowly, a look of pure malice on his face. Have it your way, Stone. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. He swung back onto his horse. Enjoy your dust bowl. With a final glare, he and his men wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a thick, choking cloud behind them. When the dust settled, the silence returned. But it was different now. It was filled with menace. He won't just let this go, Jed said, his gaze fixed on the empty trail. I didn't expect him to, Finch replied. He looked pale but resolute. His threats confirm my assessment. He must suspect something, even if he doesn't know what it is. We need to move quickly. We must get to the territorial capital in Prescott, file the claim and the partnership agreement officially. Once it's on the government books, his local influence won't matter. Prescott's a 3-day ride, Jed said, and Croft controls the main road. And the water. Then we'll need to be discreet, Finch said. We can't let him know we've left. He gestured toward the distant, hazy mountains. Is there another way? Jed nodded slowly, his mind working. There's a place I need to show you first. The reason you're here. He led Finch not towards the main creek, but to a small, forgotten arroyo tucked away in a series of rocky outcrops at the far edge of his property. It was a place he hadn't visited in years, a jagged scar in the earth hidden by mesquite and stunted junipers. The air here was different, heavier, with a strange tar-like smell. At the bottom of the dry wash, the ground wasn't just cracked mud, it was stained black. And in one spot, a thick, iridescent ooze bubbled slowly to the surface, like the earth itself was bleeding. Finch knelt, his professional excitement overriding any sense of decorum. He dipped a finger into the black goo, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger, smelling it. My God, he breathed, it's even richer than I thought. A surface seep this active means the pressure from the reservoir below is immense. He looked up at Jed, his eyes shining. This isn't just a discovery, Mr. Stone. This is the mother lode. People will write books about this find. Jed stared at the black spring, a place he'd always avoided as a boy, thinking it was some kind of cursed ground. Martha always said this land had secrets. She was more right than she knew, Finch said softly. He stood up, wiping his hand on a handkerchief. Croft's threat was not idle. "He will lay siege to this ranch. We must leave tonight." His words proved prophetic. The next 2 days were a slow-motion strangulation. Just as he'd threatened, Croft's men appeared at the edge of the property line, not crossing it, but making their presence known. They were posted at the head of the trail, watching the house. Worse, a trip to the main creek confirmed Jed's fears. A new, crude dam of rock and earth had been erected upstream, just beyond his property line, cutting off the last pitiful trickle of water. The well near his house was already dangerously low. They were being sealed in. On the evening of the second day, their canteens nearly empty, Jed and Finch stood on the porch, watching the sunset. The distant figures of Croft's men were like vultures on a fence post. "He means to wait us out," Finch said, his voice strained. "Dehydration will do his dirty work for him. By the time anyone finds us, he'll have a story ready about a stubborn old rancher who refused help." Jed stared out at the jagged peaks to the north, silhouetted against the dying light. His face was grim, set in hard lines. He'd been thinking, dredging up old memories, old stories his father used to tell. Stories of a time before roads, when smugglers and fugitives used the high country to move unseen. "The main road isn't the only way to Prescott," Jed said, his voice barely a whisper. "There's another trail, an old one. It goes through the high passes. They call it the Devil's Backbone. It's treacherous, barely wide enough for a single horse in places, and a sheer drop on one side. But it bypasses Croft's land completely, comes out on the far side of the valley, a day's ride from the capital." Finch looked from the menacing watchman to Jed's determined face. "Can we navigate it? In the dark?" "My father taught me these hills," Jed said. "I can get us through the pass before sunrise. It's a risk, a bad fall and we're buzzard meat. But staying here? That's not a risk. It's a guarantee." He met Finch's gaze, the city man and the broken rancher, bound together by a black, bubbling spring and the greed of a common enemy. "We ride tonight, or we die here tomorrow." Part 3. The moon was a sliver of bone, offering little more than a suggestion of light that made the shadows deeper and more treacherous. Jed led the way, his old mare Daisy picking her way through the rocks with the sure-footedness of a creature born to the terrain. Behind him, Alistair Finch was a dark shape on his bay, the city man's posture stiff with a tension that was part fear, part resolve. They moved like ghosts through the scrubland, circling wide around the main trail to approach the foothills from the west. The air was cool, but sweat trickled down Jed's back, a cold counterpoint to the heat of anxiety in his gut. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing horse. Every skittering rock sounded like a gunshot. The Devil's Backbone was not just a name. It was a warning. After an hour of climbing, the trail narrowed perilously. To their left was a solid wall of granite. To their right, a black abyss that fell away into nothing. Jed dismounted, signaling for Finch to do the same. "We walk 'em from here," he whispered, his voice swallowed by the immense quiet of the high country. "Keep one hand on the rock wall, and don't look down." Finch nodded, his face pale in the gloom. He held the satchel containing the contract and his geological maps tight against his chest, a testament to what was at stake. For what felt like an eternity, they shuffled along the ledge, the horses snorting nervously behind them, their hooves occasionally kicking loose pebbles that rattled into the void with a sound that seemed to last forever. Jed's senses were on fire. He knew these mountains, but he was seeing them through his father's eyes now, remembering the old warnings. A slip here, a spooked horse there, and their millionaire dreams would die on these rocks. They had almost reached the crest of the pass, a slightly wider saddle of rock where they could remount, when Jed held up a hand, freezing them in place. He pressed himself flat against the rock wall, listening. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct, rhythmic clink of a shod horse on stone, coming from the trail ahead. "Get back," he breathed, pushing Finch and the horses back around a tight bend in the trail. They huddled in the deepest shadow they could find, their hearts pounding in unison. Two riders appeared at the crest, silhouetted against the star-dusted sky. Croft's men. They weren't just watching the ranch, they were patrolling the backways too. Croft was leaving nothing to chance. "See anything?" one of the men asked, his voice carrying with unnerving clarity. "Nothing but rocks and snakes," the other grumbled. "Croft's getting spooked. Ain't nobody fool enough to try this pass at night." They paused for a moment, scanning the darkness. Jed held his breath, praying his old mare wouldn't nicker. Finch was rigid, his eyes wide. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Finally, the lead rider grunted. "Let's check the lower trail again. My throat's as dry as a preacher's sermon." They turned their horses and started back down the way they'd come. Jed waited until the sound of their hoofbeats had completely faded before he let out a slow, shaky breath. "Too close," he muttered. "He's got the whole area blanketed. We need to get off this ridge before sunrise." They moved with renewed urgency, half running, half stumbling down the far side of the pass. As the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, they were back in the relative safety of the broken, hilly country on the other side of the valley. They were through. They had beaten the siege. The ride to Prescott was a blur of exhaustion and grim determination. They pushed the horses hard, stopping only for brief rests. When they finally rode down the dusty main street of the territorial capital, they looked more like bandits than businessmen. Jed was covered in a thick layer of grime, his eyes bloodshot, and Finch's fine wool suit was torn and snagged. They went straight to the United States Land Office, a sturdy brick building that represented an authority far greater than Silas Croft. Inside, a bemused clerk listened to their story, his eyebrows rising higher and higher as Finch laid out his maps and Jed presented the partnership contract, signed by both of them with a trembling hand right there on the counter. The claim was filed, the agreement witnessed, and stamped with the official seal of the U.S. government. It was done. As they left the building, blinking in the harsh sunlight, a sense of unreality washed over Jed. He felt lightheaded. "Now what?" he asked. "Now," Finch said, a tired but triumphant smile on his face, "we pay a visit to the territorial marshal." The marshal was a leathery old lawman with skeptical eyes, but the official documents from the land office and Finch's articulate account of Croft's actions, the threats, the blockade, the damming of the creek, were enough. Attempting to starve a man off his claim and interfering with federal mineral rights, the marshal mused, stroking his chin. Silas Croft has been a boil on the backside of this territory for a long time. Sounds like it's finally time to lance it. Jed and Finch stayed in Prescott only long enough to get a hot meal, a clean bed, and fresh horses. The journey back was different. The fear was gone, replaced by a thrumming anticipation. When they crested the final ridge overlooking the Broken Stone Ranch, the sight that greeted them was a welcome one. The marshal and a posse of 6 deputies were there. Silas Croft and his men, including the 2 from the pass, were lined up, their hands bound, their faces a mixture of shock and fury. Croft's eyes met Jed's across the yard, and the hatred in them was pure enough to burn. But it was impotent now. He was just a man in ropes, his private kingdom crumbling around him. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. News of the oil strike spread like a prairie fire. The Black Spring of the Broken Stone, the papers called it. Engineers and roughnecks arrived from back east, along with wagons loaded with strange, massive pieces of equipment. The quiet solitude of Jed's land was shattered by the rhythmic clang of hammers and the shouts of hard-working men. A wooden derrick rose from the dust, a stark skeleton against the blue sky, right over the spot where the black ooze seeped from the ground. Jed watched it all, a stranger in his own life. Finch handled the business, the logistics, the payrolls. Jed, the man who knew the land, became its guardian. He oversaw the crews, ensuring they respected the property, his quiet authority more effective than any foreman's yell. He was no longer Jedediah Stone, the broke rancher. He was Mr. Stone, the partner. One evening, months later, Jed stood on his porch. It was no longer listing. It was new, rebuilt with fresh timber, solid and strong. The house behind him was repaired and expanded. Down in the valley, a second and third derrick were under construction. The clang of industry was the new sound of the valley, a sound of life and progress. Finch walked up beside him, holding 2 glasses of whiskey. "To the Stone Finch Petroleum Company," he said, handing one to Jed. Jed took the glass, the amber liquid glowing in the light of the setting sun. His gaze drifted to a newly fenced pasture near the house. The grass there was green and lush, irrigated by a powerful pump drawing from a deep well they had drilled. In the center of the pasture, one cow grazed peacefully, a dappled calico. "Bess," Jed said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You found her." "Cost me a bit more than $50 to buy her back," Finch said with a grin. "The man I sold her to had grown quite fond of her. But I insisted. She belongs here." Jed took a sip of the whiskey, its warmth spreading through him. He looked out at the derricks, the symbols of his impossible new future. He reached into his shirt and pulled out the silver locket. He didn't need to open it. He could feel Martha's smile through the metal. He hadn't just saved their land. He had honored her, turning their struggle into a legacy. The silence of failure was gone forever, replaced by the humming pulse of a new beginning, a fortune drawn from the very ground that had almost broken him.